March 28, 845. Easter Sunday. The citizens of Paris watch from their walls as 120 Viking longships glide up the Seine River, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The fleet stretches for miles, an unbroken line of dragon-headed vessels carrying 5,000 Norse warriors. The most powerful city in West Francia, home to princes and saints, is about to fall without a single stone thrown at its walls. King Charles the Bald had assembled an army to stop them. He positioned half his forces on each bank of the Seine, intending to trap the Vikings between them. The plan lasted exactly one morning. The Norse chieftain, a man the chronicles call Ragnar, concentrated his entire fleet on one shore and obliterated half the Frankish army in a single crushing assault. The survivors on the opposite bank watched their comrades die, unable to cross the river to help. They retreated. The road to Paris lay open. But the real horror came after the battle. Ragnar ordered 111 captured Frankish soldiers dragged to an island in the Seine, visible from both the remaining Frankish forces and the walls of Paris. He hanged them, one by one, as an offering to Odin. The executions took hours, the screams carried across the water. This wasn't warfare. This was a calculated message. Your God cannot protect you. Your king has abandoned you, and we will do whatever we wish. The remaining Frankish army dissolved. Charles the Bald, instead of defending his capital, fortified the Abbey of Saint-Denis to protect royal tombs and ecclesiastical treasures. The city itself was left to face the Vikings alone. Within days, Charles agreed to pay 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to make the Northmen leave. The Vikings departed as Easter ended, their ships riding low in the water from the weight of Frankish wealth. They would return 13 more times over the next 40 years. Because Charles the Bald had just taught them the most profitable lesson in Viking history. The Franks would pay to avoid a fight. The Viking siege of Paris was inevitable the moment Charlemagne's empire shattered. In 843, 2 years before the Norse reached Paris, the Treaty of Verdun formally divided the Carolingian Empire among 3 brothers. Charles the Bald inherited West Francia, a kingdom that looked impressive on maps but was crumbling from within. Charlemagne had built a sophisticated coastal defense system in 810, watchtowers, naval patrols, fortified ports. It had worked. In 820, Frankish forces repelled a Viking fleet at the mouth of the Seine. But that system required centralized authority, coordinated command, and resources devoted to external threats rather than internal power struggles. By 845, none of those conditions existed. Charles the Bald spent his entire reign fighting his brothers and nephews for control of fragments of his grandfather's empire. His half-brother Lothar controlled the Middle Kingdom. His half-brother Louis the German held the East. His nephew Pepin II claimed Aquitaine. Every summer brought new campaigns, new alliances, new betrayals. The Vikings understood this perfectly. They watched Frankish armies march past each other, ignoring Norse raiders to settle dynastic disputes. The message was clear. The Franks cared more about fighting each other than defending their coastlines. When the massive Viking fleet entered the Seine in early 845, Charles faced a choice. He could commit his full military strength to destroying the invaders, or he could preserve his core forces to fight his Frankish rivals. He chose his rivals. The army he sent to stop Ragnar was described in contemporary sources as smaller, a fraction of what he could have mustered. He divided even that reduced force on both banks of the Seine, ensuring it could not concentrate effectively. This was not incompetence. This was calculation. Charles understood that losing Paris was embarrassing but temporary. Losing the Civil War meant losing his crown permanently. He sacrificed his capital to preserve his dynasty. The citizens of Paris would pay the price for that decision. The leader of the 845 expedition exists in 2 forms: the historical chieftain Ragnar, attested in contemporary Frankish chronicles, and the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, hero of 12th century Scandinavian sagas. Modern historians recognize that Ragnar is largely a mythological construct, a composite figure created centuries later to glorify the ancestors of powerful Viking dynasties. But for understanding 845, what matters is the historical Reginherus and what drove him. Norse society ran on a prestige economy. Wealth alone meant nothing. What mattered was how you acquired it and how you distributed it. A chieftain who returned from a successful raid with immense plunder could attract and retain followers by generous gift-giving. More followers meant more warriors for the next raid, which meant more prestige, which attracted more followers. The system was self-reinforcing, but it required constant success. A chieftain who failed to deliver wealth or glory lost his warriors to rivals. Reginherus commanded 120 ships and approximately 5,000 men. Assembling a fleet of that size required reputation, wealth, and the promise of massive returns. This was not a scouting expedition or opportunistic coastal raid. This was a full-scale military campaign targeting one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. The goal was to secure enough treasure to establish dominance over rival Norse factions back in Scandinavia. The scale of the operation also suggests political backing from Scandinavian royalty. Later sources connect the raid to King Horik of Denmark, who likely provided resources and legitimacy in exchange for a share of the plunder. For both Reginherus and Horik, the Paris expedition was an investment in political power. The spiritual terror that would follow was entirely unexpected. The Vikings entered the Seine River system in early March 845, moving inland with methodical precision. Unlike earlier raids that struck coastal targets and withdrew, this fleet pushed deep into Frankish territory, burning villages and monasteries along the riverbanks. Local defenses were either bypassed or overwhelmed. The fleet moved faster than messengers carrying news of its approach. Charles the Bald finally responded as the Vikings neared Paris. He assembled a force. Chronicles emphasize it was smaller than needed, and split it on both banks of the Seine. The strategy assumed the Vikings would attempt to land on both shores simultaneously, dividing their own forces. Reginherus did the opposite. He concentrated his entire fleet on one bank and launched a ferocious assault. The Frankish force was outnumbered, outflanked, and fighting men who lived for exactly this kind of close-quarters slaughter. The Norse warriors carried axes, swords, and shields. They had armor. They had discipline forged through years of raiding across Europe. The Frankish defenders had been scraped together from local levies, poorly equipped and commanded by nobles whose primary military experience was fighting other Franks. The battle was brief and catastrophic. Half of Charles's army was routed. The survivors streamed away from the riverbank, abandoning weapons and supplies. The Frankish forces on the opposite bank watched the massacre unfold, unable to cross to assist. They retreated without engaging, correctly assessing that they would suffer the same fate if they tried to stop the Vikings alone. The path to Paris was now undefended. The Vikings loaded their ships and continued upriver. They arrived at the city walls on March 28th, Easter Sunday. The timing was either calculated cruelty or remarkable coincidence. For the Christian population of Paris, watching pagan warriors arrive on the holiest day of the year felt like apocalypse. Reginherus now had a problem. Paris was fortified. Its walls were intact. Storming the city would cost lives, time, and momentum. A prolonged siege would allow Charles to gather reinforcements or launch a counterattack. The Vikings needed the city to surrender without a fight. So Reginherus created terror. He ordered 111 captured Frankish soldiers brought to an island in the Seine, positioned so that both the remaining Frankish forces outside the city and the citizens on the walls could see clearly. The prisoners were hanged, one by one, as sacrifices to Odin. The executions were public, deliberate, and prolonged. The number itself may have had ritual significance in Norse religion, or it may simply have been the total number of prisoners taken. Either way, the effect was calculated. The Frankish forces watching from outside the city broke. Some fled entirely. Others retreated to defensive positions, but made no attempt to relieve Paris. Inside the city, morale collapsed. The citizens had just watched their king's army destroyed and their captured soldiers executed as pagan offerings. The message was unmistakable. Their god, their king, and their army could not save them. Charles the Bald, rather than mounting a defense of Paris itself, fortified the abbey of Saint-Denis several miles away. Saint-Denis was the burial place of Frankish kings, the symbolic heart of the dynasty. Charles chose to defend his family's legitimacy rather than his capital's population. The decision was pragmatic from a dynastic perspective. Losing royal tombs and ecclesiastical treasures to pagan desecration would be politically catastrophic. But to the citizens of Paris, it felt like abandonment. The Vikings occupied the city and began systematic plunder. The execution of the 111 men had accomplished exactly what Ragnar intended. Resistance collapsed without him losing a single warrior to siege warfare. The Vikings had won. They controlled Paris, held its wealth, and faced no organized opposition. Then the invisible enemy struck. A plague erupted in the Viking camp, likely dysentery or typhus spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation near the river. The disease killed rapidly. Contemporary sources claim more Vikings died from illness than from combat with the Franks. For warriors who had just triumphed through violence, dying helplessly from disease was terrifying and inexplicable. The Norse religious response failed. Prayers and sacrifices to their gods produced no relief. The plague worsened. At some point, the sources disagree on details, a Christian captive suggested the Vikings observe a fast. Whether from desperation or curiosity, Ragnar ordered it. The plague subsided. The timing may have been coincidental. The disease may have simply run its course. But the Vikings interpreted the fast's success as evidence that the Christian god possessed real power. Frankish chroniclers, particularly those recording the Annales Bertiniani, attributed the plague specifically to Saint-Germain of Paris, claiming the saint had cursed the Vikings for desecrating his city. This spiritual explanation served Frankish propaganda brilliantly. It transformed a humiliating military defeat into a divine victory. Yes, the king had paid tribute and allowed the city to be plundered, but Saint-Germain had punished the invaders with plague. The Vikings had won the physical battle but lost the spiritual war. For the demoralized Frankish population, this narrative provided desperately needed psychological compensation for the material catastrophe. For Ragnar and his men, however, the experience planted genuine fear. They had taken immense wealth from Paris, but the treasure felt cursed. When the Vikings began dying, first from plague, then mysteriously after returning home, the connection seemed obvious. The Christian god was real, powerful, and vengeful. But the victory was poisoned. When Ragnar returned to King Horic's court, he was described in sources as distressed and weeping, making religious claims about his time in Paris. Several of his surviving warriors died shortly after reaching home. The plague that had killed so many in Paris appeared to be following them. King Horic, confronted with dying warriors and reports of Christian supernatural power, made a shocking decision. He ordered the execution of the surviving raiders and released his Christian captives. This was an unprecedented act. Horic was executing successful warriors who had delivered the greatest treasure in his kingdom's history. He was admitting that the spiritual cost of the raid negated its material benefit. The decision reflected genuine terror. Horic believed Saint-Germain, or the Christian god, had cursed the wealth, that holding it would bring destruction on his kingdom. Executing the warriors was an attempt to appease the foreign deity and end the supernatural retribution. The 7,000 livres of silver, rather than securing political dominance, had become a liability so dangerous that Horic was willing to kill his own men to be rid of its taint. Following the executions, King Horic received Archbishop Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, on friendly terms in his kingdom. Ansgar had been working to convert Scandinavian rulers for years with limited success. Now, traumatized by the Paris plague and its aftermath, Horic was suddenly receptive to Christian missionaries. The chain of events, raid, plague, execution, reception of Ansgar, demonstrates that the siege of Paris accelerated Christian penetration into Scandinavia far more effectively than decades of peaceful missionary work. But they returned home spiritually shaken, convinced they had encountered power beyond their understanding. The cursed treasure that cost lives even in victory became legendary, a cautionary tale about the price of raiding Christian lands. The 845 siege of Paris destroyed the illusion of Frankish military competence and Viking invincibility simultaneously. The Franks were exposed as fractured, led by a king who prioritized dynastic survival over territorial defense. The payment of Danegeld established a system of institutionalized extortion that would drain the kingdom for decades and invite escalating attacks. Paris fell not because its walls were weak, but because its defenders were abandoned. Yet the Vikings, for all their material success, returned home carrying spiritual terror. The plague at Paris, the deaths after their return, and King Horic's desperate executions revealed that conquest of Christian Europe came with psychological costs no amount of silver could offset. The treasure that should have secured Reginhirus's legacy instead became evidence that some victories are too expensive to survive. The lasting lesson of 845 was not learned for 40 more years. When Vikings besieged Paris again in 885-886, the city's walls held against an even larger force. The difference was leadership, defenders who refused to surrender, and a king who chose to fight rather than pay. That resistance proved that tribute had never been necessary, only politically convenient. The shame of 845 finally became the catalyst for genuine defense. But by then, generations of Frankish wealth had already flowed north, financing the Viking Age at the expense of a broken empire.